Hello, it is the book traveler, and I have traveled myself all the way to Vienna in Austria. And this is an absolutely beautiful city, which is so worth a visit. There's so much beautiful architecture and culture here in Austria. Some amazing people as well, great cuisine, and so many different things to see around the city. I've got here a little bit late. It was a beautiful day outside earlier, but I was planning to go out and show you some of the wonderful sights. But unfortunately, it's just started absolutely pouring down. So, unfortunately, that's left me looking out of the window at places we might have seen instead. But what I'm going to do is try and give you a view of what I can see outside my window in the hotel here, and there is the city. If you can see through the rain on the windows of Vienna, the building immediately in front of you now is the Mozart Hall, the concert house, and there's a big outside arena there which they're setting up for some summer concerts. And just to the other side of that, if you can see a green domed building in the background is St. Charles's Church, or Karlskirche, if you want to speak in local dialect. And that also includes a memorial to Vivaldi. And if we just move around a little bit further as well, we can see uh, just out down in the corner there's a very impressive building just over here, which looks very nice. Some nice architecture and shields on there. And actually, that's a high school, very impressive academic high school. And the park that's down to the bottom of it is home to a homage to Beethoven. So in a very small area, we've got Beethoven, Vivaldi, and Mozart all in one place. So apologies I can't get out and show you those properly, but nevertheless, I am going to give you a reading session anyway, and we are still reading The Wager, and I finished in Oslo, part 3 of the book, and we're going to move forward into part 4 now, which is entitled Deliverance, with chapter 17 entitled Byron's Choice. So I'm sure you don't want to look at me. I'm going to spin you around, give you a view of Austria, Vienna, whilst I read to you, and hopefully it'll be enjoyable. So, chapter 17. As the boat headed out to sea, John Byron stared at Cheap, standing forlorn on the shore in the spectral mist. Byron had been led to believe that Cheap would be brought along with them on the journey, at least as a prisoner. But they had just left him here. Left him without a working boat, no doubt to perish. I had all along been in the dark as to turn this affair would take, Byron would write. He had originally made a choice that he could bear, abandoning the mission to return home was a decision that might subvert his naval career, but it would save his life. Doing this to Captain Cheap was different. To play a role in totally deserting his commander, no matter how flawed and tyrannical he was, threatened the romantic image of himself that he had clung to despite the horrors of the voyage. As he continued watching Cheap in the distance, he and some of the men shouted 3 cheers to their old captain, and then Cheap was gone and Byron's decision seemed irreversible. Even before the boats sailed past Wager Island, the men were struck by a squall, as if they were already being punished for their sins. Then Byron heard a loud, unnerving sound. The makeshift foresail on the vaunted new longboat had split and was flapping uncontrollably. The party was forced to seek shelter in the lagoon of another island just west of Cheap's Bay, where they could repair the sail and wait out the storm. They had travelled barely a mile. The next day, Bulkley asked for volunteers to take the barge back to Wager Island and retrieve a discarded canvas tent in case they needed later extra sailcloth. Byron suddenly saw an opportunity. He offered to go with the party, as did Midshipman Campbell, and that afternoon they set off with 8 other men, rowing through the jarring waves. Campbell shared Byron's misgivings, and while the 2 young midshipmen were being tossed about and doused by spray, they began to conspire. If they wanted to escape the stain of dishonour and cowardice, Byron believed they must retrieve Cheap. Campbell agreed, murmuring that now was the time. Hoping to sneak away with the barge, they tried to enlist the other men on board, who included several of Cheap's erstwhile supporters. They, too, had been shocked by the abandonment of the captain. Fearing they would be hanged if they ever made it back to England, they joined the counterplot. As Byron rode on with the others, he became increasingly uneasy. What if Bulkeley and his men suspected that they had no intention of returning? They might not mind the defections. It would mean fewer bodies to transport and mouths to feed, but they would be enraged over the loss of the barge, which they would want to for added space and to send hunting parties on shore. As night fell, Byron and his companions anxiously ploughed through the waves in the dark until they spotted campfires flickering in the distance. The outpost. Byron and his party had made it safely back to Wager Island. Cheap was astonished by the men's arrival, and when he learned what they had resolved to do, he seemed invigorated. He welcomed Byron and Campbell into his dwelling, and, along with Surgeon Elliot and the Marine Lieutenant Hamilton, they stayed up late, chatting, hopefully about their prospects now that they were free of the men behind the rebellion. There were 20 people on the island, 13 at the main settlement, and another 7 at the seceders' camp. Cheap and his party had at least one usable boat, the barge, and they could also try to repair the yawl. When Byron awoke the next morning, though he confronted the grim reality, he had nothing to put on but a hat, torn trousers, and the remaining threads of a waistcoat. His shoes had disintegrated, leaving him barefoot. Most distressing, he had no reserves of food, not even a slough cake. And the rest of the men who had returned with him also had nothing. Their scant rations had been stored on the Speedwell, with the very people they'd just double-crossed. Cheap shared some of his meat. It was rotten, and in any case there wasn't enough of it to sustain them for long. Byron, who had constantly been guided by the whims of superiors, finally tried to formulate a plan of his own. He decided that he must go back to the mutineers and claim the portion of food owed his party. It would be risky, perhaps even foolhardy, but what other option was there? When Byron proposed the idea, Cheap warned that his enemies would seek vengeance and commandeer the barge, leaving the rest of them stranded. Byron had thought about that. He said that he and Campbell and a small party could land the barge some distance away from the lagoon. Then, while most of them guarded the boat, he and Campbell would complete the trek to Bulkeley's party. They would be vulnerable to retaliation, but the temptation of food was too overpowering, and with Cheap's encouragement, Byron and his small party embarked that morning. After they paddled to the other island, they hid the barge in a secluded area. Byron and Campbell bade farewell to their companions and began their arduous trek. They slogged through the sticky swamps and knotted forests until, that night, they reached the edge of the Black Lagoon. They heard voices in the darkness. Most of the mutineers, including their leaders, Bulkeley and Baines, were on shore scouring for food, that perpetual quest. Bulkeley appeared baffled by the 2 midshipmen's sudden appearance. Why had they arrived overland without the barge? Byron, summoning his courage, declared that they would not desert Cheap. Bulkeley seemed stung by Byron's defection. He assumed that Byron had been coerced by Campbell. Either that, or the aristocratic midshipman had reverted to the embedded orders of class and hierarchy. In a veiled comment in his journal, Bulkeley wrote that the Honourable Mr. Byron could not quite accommodate himself to lie forward with the men. When Byron and Campbell asked for their party's share of the food, Bulkeley and Baines demanded to know where the barge was. Campbell told them that they had intended to keep the boat. After all, it was meant to carry 10 castaways, and 10 of them were now staying with Cheap. One of the mutineers snapped, "Damn you," and warned them that unless they brought back the barge, they would be given nothing. Byron made a plea directly to the rest of the men, but they told him that if he did not bring the barge the next day, they'd arm the cutter and come after him. Byron walked away. Then, distraught, he walked back and asked again. It was futile. He wondered how people could be so cruel. As he departed, he lost his hat in a gust of wind. The seaman John Duck walked over to his old companion and generously gave him his own hat. Byron was overcome by this flash of kindness. "John," he exclaimed, "I thank you," but insisted that he could not leave Duck without a hat. He returned it. Then Byron hurried away with Campbell back to the barge and across the sea with his party, occasionally glancing behind him to see if they were being pursued by a cutter gleaming with guns. On to Chapter 18, Port of God's Mercy. The moment the winds calmed, Bulkeley, Lieutenant Baines, and the other men on the 2 remaining boats shipped out. They were within striking distance of the outpost, but Bulkley ignored pleas to launch an assault to take the barge, and instead led his men in another direction, south towards the Strait of Magellan. There would be no more looking back. As they forged onward, it became clear, even to the old sea dogs like Bulkley, that the journey in the castaway boats would be unlike anything that they had ever experienced. The Speedwell was not that much bigger than the original longboat, which had been designed to fit 20 oarsmen and to ferry supplies over short distances. Now the Speedwell was jammed with enough casks of water to last them a month, and with enough guns and ammunition to ward off an attack. Most of all, the boat was crammed with men squeezed on the bow, around the masts by the tiller, in the hold below decks. The boat looked as if it had been jury-rigged with human limbs. With 59 people on board, there was no space to lie down, and it was nearly impossible for the crew to move about to raise a sail or pull a rope. After serving several hours on watch, the men on deck would struggle to switch places with those below in the hold, which was as dank and dark as a coffin, but provided a measure of protection from the elements. To urinate or defecate, a person had to lean over the side of the hull. The stench of the men's wet clothes alone, Bulkley wrote, makes the air we breathe nauseous to that degree that one would think it impossible for a man to live. Weighed down with human cargo and supplies, the hull rested so low in the sea that its stern was barely 4 inches above the waterline. Even small waves washed over the gunwales, soaking the men. In choppy seas, the crew on deck was nearly swept overboard with every roll. The 12 people on the cutter, including the purser, Thomas Harvey, had it worse. The boat was only 25 feet long, and it was even less stable in the waves, which during severe storms dwarfed its single mast. The men sat bunched together on hard, narrow planks, bouncing up and down. There was no area below where crew members could find shelter, and at night they would sometimes clamber into Speedwell to sleep, while the cutter was towed behind. At such times the longboat was stuffed with 71 men. Not only did these vessels have to traverse some of the roughest seas on earth, but most of them, attempting to pull off his feet, were already near death. The greatest part of the people on board are so regardless of life that they really appear quite indifferent whether they shall live or die, Bulkley wrote, and it is with much entreaty that any of them can be prevailed on to come upon deck to assist for their preservation. For Bulkley, leading the party under such circumstances was extraordinarily challenging, and the unusual power dynamics at play compounded the difficulty. Although Bulkley was in most respects acting as the captain, Lieutenant Baines officially remained the commanding officer. On October 30, 2 weeks into the voyage, the men were caught in another squall. As the winds cannonaded across the Pacific and waves crashed over them, Bulkley spied, along the mountainous coastline to the east, a sliver of a channel. He thought it might lead to a safe harbour, but it was surrounded by rocks like those that had carved a hole in the wager. Bulkley often consulted with Baines because of their arrangement, and with the carpenter Cummins because of trust. Such consultations also seemed to be Bulkley's way of underlining the difference between himself and the captain he had deposed. Bulkley now confronted his first major tactical decision: to remain in the open ocean or to try slip between the rocks. Nothing but death before our eyes in keeping the sea, and the same prospect in running in with the land, he noted. As the ships tipped further and further over, he chose the channel. The entrance is so dangerous that no mortal would attempt it, unless his case was desperate as ours. As the men approached the chute, they heard a menacing roar, breakers smashing upon the reefs. One miscue and they would sink. Lookouts scanned the waters for submerged rocks while crewmen worked the sails. Bulkley, bracing himself and barking out orders, guided them through the labyrinth of rocks until they were sitting snugly in a harbour shielded by cliffs with crystalline waterfalls. The spot was so commodious, Bulkley boasted, the whole British Navy could gather within it. He had little time to relish his triumph. Parties were ferried ashore in the cutter to collect fresh water and any shellfish, or as Bulkley put it, whatever Providence throws in our way. Then the men were off again, plunging back into a riotous sea. On November 3rd, during a heavy rainstorm, Bulkley signalled to his cutter's crew to stay close. Soon afterward, the cutter split its mainsail and disappeared. Bulkley and his party tacked back and forth, searching for the other boat. Each time the Speedwell crested above the waves, yet there was no sight of the cutter. It must have gone under with all 12 men. At last, the Speedwell itself, labouring ominously, Bulkley and Baines gave up and ducked into an inlet along the coast. Bulkeley experienced the grief of losing men who were effectively under his command, and despite the cramped conditions inside the Speedwell's berth, he retrieved his journal and carefully inscribed their names. The lost included Harvey, the purser, Richard Phillips, the ingenious builder of rafts, and William Oram, the carpenter's mate, whom Bulkeley had persuaded to leave the Seceders in the hope of reaching England. Because of the Speedwell's deep keel and heavy hull, it could not be brought too close to the rocky coast, and without the cutter, the men had no way of sending people ashore to hunt for food. Only a few of them could swim. We are now in a most wretched condition, Bulkeley confessed. On November 5th, they tried to head out to sea, only to be beaten by the backstorm. Trapped again on the boat and consumed by hunger, they stared agonizingly at a few mussels on the rocks. At wit's end, the boatswain King grabbed several oars and empty barrels, fastened them together with rope, and then lowered the bizarre-looking device into the water. It floated. He and the other two men flopped on to the top of the contraption and began paddling towards shore. After travelling only a few feet, a wave hoisted the barrels in the air and catapulted the men into the sea. They thrashed for their lives. 2 were plucked out of the water by the crew on the Speedwell, but King managed to grab hold of the mangled raft and kick his way to shore. That evening, he returned with what sustenance he could, and revealed that on the beach he had seen an empty food cask, which appeared to be the kind issued by the British Navy. The castaways grew solemn, wondering whether another vessel, perhaps even Commodore Anson's flagship the Centurion, had sunk like the Wager. The next morning, as Bulkeley and his party resumed their voyage, they glimpsed on the barren ocean a wisp of white, dipping amid the waves and then rising again. It was the cutter's sail. The boat was intact, and there were the dozen crew members, soaked and dazed but alive. The miraculous reunion, Bulkeley wrote, gave them all new life. After heading into a cove and deploying the cutter to collect shellfish, they tried to get some rest. The cutter was roped to the stern of the Speedwell, and its crew, except for a seaman named James Stewart, crawled onto the Speedwell to sleep. At 2 in the morning, the rope snapped, sending the cutter careering across the sea. Bulkeley and several other men looked out in the rain-swept darkness. There was Stewart on the boat, barreling towards the reefs. The men called to him, but he was too far away to hear them over the wind, and before long the cutter was gone, this time no doubt forever shattered upon the rocks. The men had lost not only another companion, but also their means of going ashore for sustenance. Moreover, 70 castaways would now have to be packed day and night into the Speedwell. Great uneasiness among the people, many of them despairing of a deliverance, Bulkeley wrote. The following day, 11 of the men, including Phipps, requested to be cast out into this desolate part of the world rather than continue in the seemingly doomed Speedwell. Bulkeley and Baines, ever conscious of the legal ramifications, drafted a certificate for the Lords of the Admiralty, stating that the 11 men had willingly made a decision and indemnified all persons from ever being called to an account for putting us on shore. Bulkeley wrote in his journal that these men were leaving for the preservation of themselves and us. Bulkeley brought the boat as close to the shore as possible, and the 11 leapt off. He watched them swim to a lifeless patch of land, the last time they would ever be reported seen. Then he and the remaining party on the Speedwell sailed on. On November 10th, nearly a month after embarking from Wager Island, and after travelling some 400 miles, Bulkeley observed a string of small barren islands. They looked, he thought, exactly like those that Sir John Narborough had described as being at the northwest mouth of the Strait of Magellan. To the south, on the opposite side of the mouth, was another bleak island with dark, rocky, serrated mountains. Bulkeley figured that this must be Desolation Island, named by Narborough because it was so desolate a land to behold. Bulkeley, based on these observations and on his calculations to the Speedwell's latitude, was confident that they had reached the Strait of Magellan. After he tacked the Speedwell to the southeast, on the verge of realizing his plan, he betrayed a feeling that he rarely acknowledged, absolute fear. "I never in my life have seen such a sea as runs here," he observed. The winds were of typhoon strength, and the waters seemed at war with themselves. Bulkeley believed that he was witnessing the confluence of the Pacific Ocean pouring into the Strait of the Atlantic Ocean pouring out. At the same spot where the British buccaneer Francis Drake had been caught in what Chaplin on board his ship had called an intolerable tempest. The chaplain wrote that the god had seemingly set himself against us, and would not withdraw his judgment till he had buried our bodies, and ships also, in the bottomless depth of the raging sea. Waves began to swallow the Speedwell from stern to bow, hull to mast tops. One rolled in the Speedwell more than 20 degrees, then 50, then 80, until it had broached, lying completely on its side, with its masts and sails pressed against the water. As the boat creaked and buckled and flooded, Bulkeley was sure she would never rise again. After all he had been through, all his sacrifices and sins, he now confronted his prospect of a futile death, of drowning without having seen his family again. Yet, ever so slowly, the Speedwell began to right itself, the sails emerging as water spilled from the deck and hold. Each momentary reprieve seemed to intensify Bulkeley's messianic fervour. He wrote of the storm, "We prayed earnestly for its clearing up, for nothing else could save us from perishing." In what he described as a grace of light, they glimpsed a cove and tried to reach it by running a gauntlet of breakers. We were surrounded with rocks, and so near that a man might toss a biscuit on them, he observed, yet they slipped into the cove, which was smooth as a mill-pond. We call this harbour the port of God's mercy, esteeming our preservation this day to be a miracle, Bulkeley wrote. The most abandoned amongst us no longer doubt of an almighty being, and have promised to reform their lives. With each grinding day, though, the men were becoming more dispirited and unruly. They incessantly demanded extra rations, and Bulkeley and Baines found themselves in the same unwinnable position that had confounded Cheap. If we were not exceedingly provident in regarding of serving our provisions, we must all inevitably starve, Bulkeley noted. The men who had once followed him so eagerly, so devotedly, now seemed, as he put it, ripe for mutiny and destruction. He added, "We know not what to bring them under any command. They have troubled us to that degree that we are weary of our lives." Along with Baines and Cummins, he strained to maintain order. The signed articles governing the party sanctioned the abandonment of anyone who caused unrest. Yet Bulkeley made a very different sort of threat if the misbehaviour continued. He, along with Baines and Cummins, would demand to be deposited on shore, leaving the others to fend for themselves on the boat. The crew knew that Bulkeley was indispensable. No one else could be monomaniacally plot their course and the battle of the elements, so his threat had sobering effect. The people were promised to be under government, and seemed much easier, Bulkeley wrote. To further pacify the men, he released a bit more flour from their stores, noting that many people eat the powder raw as soon as they are served it. Nevertheless, they were dying. Among the casualties was a 16-year-old boy named George Bateman. This poor creature starved, perished, and died a skeleton, Bulkeley wrote, adding, "There are several more in the same miserable condition, and who, without a speedy relief, must undergo the same fate." He endeavoured to comfort the ailing, but what they most wanted was nourishment. One 12-year-old boy pleaded to a close companion for some extra flour, saying that he would otherwise not live to see Brazil, but his shipmate was unmoved. "Persons who have not experienced the hardships we have met with," Bulkeley wrote, "will wonder how people can be so inhuman to see their fellow creatures starving before their faces, and afford them no relief. But hunger is void of all compassion." The boy's misery ended only when the heaven sent death to his relief. On November 24, the Speedwell became caught in a mystifying maze of channels and lagoons. Baines accused Bulkeley of being mistaken about having entered the strait. Had they wasted 2 weeks going the wrong way? Bulkeley countered that if there ever was such a place in the world as the Strait of Magellan, we are now in them. But faced with growing dissent, he turned the boat around, heading back the way they had come. One marine began to go mad, laughing hysterically until he slumped over in silence, dead. Another man died shortly after, and then another. Their bodies were tossed into the sea. It took the surviving party close to 2 weeks to retrace its path, only to then realize that they had found the strait all along. Now they had to start east all over again. Maybe Cheap was right. Maybe they should have headed north. That's the end of chapter 18. Next, chapter 19, called The Haunting, and I'll come back to that in a separate reading. Hope you enjoyed the view outside the window here in Vienna, Austria. Sorry about the phone call intermission. I'll leave it there and come back to you in a little while.